stars are a long way away. So, if you get a signal or you detect a technosignature from someone who's 50 light years away, it's going to be a pretty stilted conversation. Like, yo, what's up? And then 50 years later, hey, man. And then 50 years later, what do you do? So it's just, so the idea that there's going to be a meaningful dialogue.
Hello from the children of planet Earth.
So welcome one and all to the Interstellar radio show. I'm your host for today's episode. I'm David Kipping. I'm a professor of astronomy at Columbia University, and I lead a group called the Cool Worlds Lab, where we research exoplanets. But today isn't about me. It's about our guest, fellow New Yorker, Adam Frank from Rochester University. Adam is the Helen and Fred Gowan Professor of Physics and Astronomy at Rochester and is a prominent researcher, science commentator, and popular author. And leaving just those formalities aside, I have to say Adam's one of my favorite people to shoot the breeze with when thinking about alien life. We always have a good time discussing these topics. He's a very creative scientist, overflowing with ideas, and a kind and generous colleague to boot. And he's also the biggest Expanse fan I know. I think that's true, right? So Adam, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining me today. I know you're very busy.
It's a pleasure.
So, we got to know each other through our shared interests of thinking about life in the universe and alien life in the universe. And indeed we've collaborated on topics in that domain. But like so many of those of us who arrive in this field, that wasn't where we began our academic journeys. So I was kind of interested as a point of jumping off for those who are interested in getting into this field, hearing about your journey. How did you transition or shift into this, and what sparked that shift?
Yeah, it's interesting because I always had an interest in aliens, right, or in life in the universe. That was one of the questions as a kid. I got into astronomy when I was, 5 years old, literally. My dad's the pulp science fiction magazine covers, which often had bug-eyed monsters on them, is where what got me started. But as a research topic, it didn't really capture my imagination at the time, because this, I was in graduate school in the late 80s, and there was, SETI had been around for a while. And there was even Woody Sullivan, who was a professor at the University of Rochester, who I loved. I adored working with him. I taught a class with him, and he, was a SETI practitioner. But there was a fundamental part of the traditional SETI, which I just never agreed with, which was the idea that, basically, mostly you were looking for beacons. You had to hope that somebody had put a powerful radio transmitter somewhere and was actually sending signals out with the purpose of being detected. Now, there was leakage. People did talk about leakage, but so much of the effort was in beacons. And that always just seemed a little too anthropomorphic or anthropocentric to me.
There's someone really screaming out into the dark, like, hey, right. Look at me, waving my arms, come talk to me. And obviously we don't really do that, do we? It's something that we hope others are doing, but it's not an activity that there's no systematic program for screaming out hello to the universe.
And it's not even clear if it's a good idea. There's the whole question of messaging extraterrestrial intelligence, which I absolutely agree is morally suspect. I mean, who decides whether or not we should be screaming into the night? And also, I've read enough science fiction, the whole idea that there might be wolves among the stars, the three-body problem, that very well-known science fiction series. It's not clear to me that it's a good idea to announce your presence. And some people will say, oh, well, we've been announcing our presence, since TV. Those signals are pretty weak. And unless you're really looking at Earth, you probably wouldn't find them. So, yeah, so I think, so anyway, to get to the story. So, I was always interested in this subject, but as a research practitioner, I didn't want to go in that direction. And also in the late 80s, it was still the giggle factor, as we call it. SETI still would get raised eyebrows, right? Oh, SETI, what little green man. And also my own inclinations, I'm a theoretical astrophysicist, and the first thing I really wanted to get involved in was theory, deep theory about fluid dynamics and black holes and whatnot. So my research path was as a computational astrophysicist. I built codes to simulate things like gas dynamics, magneto-gas dynamics. So things like the formation of stars, the death of stars, the accretion disks around, real meat and potatoes kind of astronomy problems. And that's what I did for most of my career. But I was also doing the writing. So I always, because of Carl Sagan, I had a strong interest in science outreach. And it really wasn't so much science outreach. It was because I wanted to understand what I loved about Sagan is he always put science into context, right? I mean, that there were these other things that were happening in human civilization, of which science was just one part of. And I was always had a strong interest in philosophy and history. So I wanted to write about those topics. And it was actually through that I was working with NPR, and I was working on what was we had a blog with NPR for a long time, and there was something they called the Cities Project. They were doing things about the growth of urbanization in the world, and they asked me if I'd be interested. And so I conceived of a project that looked at cities from three levels: the level of the street, which was Newtonian physics; the level of the rooftop, which was going to be thermodynamics; and then the level, the 10,000 foot level. And that was, sort of turned out to be astrobiology, really. It was like seeing, how cities fit into the biosphere. So it was really planetary cities as a planetary scale phenomena. And that got me thinking about climate change and aliens. I started thinking about whether or not, if cities are really, if this technosphere that we've developed and this massive change in the planet's function, which also goes by the name of the Anthropocene, if we're doing it, maybe this is a common thing. Maybe just like any civilization, as it harvests more energy, we'll get to the point that we've gotten to, which is where we're triggering climate change. So I actually did a bunch of work on that, and that is what led me to, that was like my first papers in this topic. So it was really around, it was this weird sideways effort, starting to think about civilizations and their trajectories, that led me into what is now called Technosignatures. So yeah, I got there.
And it's just the examples you give there show how interdisciplinary this is, right? Because it's spanning everything from, urban development to climate change to planetary geophysics to astrobiology. Yeah. So that's one of the unique things about this field. I'm sure as a result of your work, certainly I know it's true for many, that it does lead you to a richer intellectual experience. Right, God, as a result of those kinds of interactions.
Yeah. You know what the best part about that? So in taking that journey, I had to really learn a lot of planetary physics, a lot of, geophysics and geology. And now, because I'm an avid backpacker. And when I go into the mountains now, it's like, I feel like I'm going into an alien planet, right? To see the Earth as just one example of, an infinite number of instantiations of planets, all of which will have geophysics happening, some of which will have biogeochemical physics happening, and some of which will have So it's it really profoundly affects, I think, working in this domain affects how you view the world around you, including history, including what we're going through now with all the crazy stuff, historically.
And how has, you said there was a giggle factor in the 80s, and there are still maybe some degree some resistance to, it's only just starting to breach, right? That federal funding agencies are now starting, as because you have a NASA grant to that effect. But how is the cultural shift changing? And is there some way still to go? Do you think this is kind of as good as it's going to get, or do you think it's going to continue to eventually become almost mainstream academically at some point?
I think it's going to become mainstream academically. I mean, the shift that it had to happen, right? Because, in 1995, we discovered the first exoplanet. And then, by the early 2000s, we were discovering enough of them to beginning to generate a census of exoplanets. And then you get Kepler, and then there's this avalanche, such to the point that we know that now every, star in the sky has a family of worlds orbiting it. And with that came NASA's, and same thing actually in the early 90s because of the Mars rock, Alan
Bill
Hill.
Clinton stood on the lawn and the Alan Hills rock, right? Yeah.
I think it was the Alan Hills. Yeah, right. I always forget the name, but yeah, right. So astrobiology suddenly got this giant kick in the mid 90s. One, because we discovered these planets. And if we discovered the planets, we're going to start naturally thinking about what kind of life you can get on those planets. And then the emphasis in the solar system, because of the Mars rock, even though the Mars rock turned out probably not to have anything to do with life. it started NASA really rethinking about the biology in the solar system. And then, of course, you had the Enceladus and Europa, the ocean moon. So, so there was this explosion in astrobiology starting in the mid 90s, really gaining speed in the last 2 decades. And of course, that was all the search for, I'm sorry to say it, I don't mean to insult the microbes. Microbes are my good friends, but I don't mean, let them dumb.
I don't think any of them are listening right now. It's okay.
Yeah, right. But if they are, I want to know. I'm sorry. I'm just using this term for, just to highlight the differences. So there was this enormous, literally millions of dollars being put into the search for dumb life, meaning microbial life, right? And so at some point it becomes a little ridiculous to be like, yes, we'll spend all this money for for dumb life, but don't even think about bringing up, smart life, because that's crazy, right? That was the idea of the giggle factor, like thinking about, technology creating life. That's nuts. Only crazy people, on the fringe think about that. And yet you've just funded, $30 million worth of work on potential routes for photosynthesis on alien worlds. It's like, at some point, it just doesn't make any sense. And I think we've broached that. We've crossed that line. It's funny, in the NASA, the exobiology call used to have like this really explicit thing in it that was like, don't bring us anything about intelligence. It wasn't really that. It was more about like SETI and radio signatures. But they were really, they'll say they weren't discouraging it, but we all knew. And they were, listen, NASA was always trying to do their best, given the fact that they've gotten burned by Congress a bunch of times. But then that 2018 meeting changed everything, right? Where somebody in Congress put in, give 10 to NASA, $10 million for technosignatures. And NASA was like, what? Okay, let's have a meeting to see what we would do with that $10 million. And that's where it all began. That was really, I think,
which sounds like a lot of money, but is actually, and $10 million doesn't go very far, right? As you know, that's like a couple of grants, basically, right. 2 or 3 grants. So it sounds like a lot, but we're barely scratching the surface.
Right. And then the $10 million never showed up, by the way. That was supposedly in the congressional budget, but it got zeroed out. So, but I think it did make it okay for NASA. NASA now felt that it had some political cover to begin opening the doors a little bit. So that was, we put in a grant. We had, with Jason Wright and Jacob Hock-Mizra and Ravi Kapoor, we put in a grant. The first one got killed. Second one, we got it through. I'm the PI on that one. And it's been so much fun. It's been the conversations, as like our conversations are like, whoa, mind blown.
I love the fact we now have a platform to discuss this a bit more openly, whereas before it was maybe in hushed conversations in corridors. It's starting to become a little bit more something we can discuss openly in scientific papers and have intellectual freedom and fun with. Yeah. Now one paper because we're talking about that was 2018 with the Technosignatures meeting, but before then you were writing papers on Technosignatures. I remember one I wanted to talk to you about was one you read in 2015, and it just kind of sets the scale, I think, of the galaxy quite nicely. You showed with Bill Sullivan that if the fraction of Earth-like planets or habitable planets, however you want to define that, go on to spawn life is more than 1 in 10 billion, then you should really expect there to be other life bearing planets in our galaxy. And you can even extend that to the whole universe. Now, that kind of implies, I think, when you hear that statement, that unless the probability is astronomically small, there's someone else out there. And indeed, the media definitely, I know, caught that breeze and got excited about the consequences of that. But of course, one challenge with this reasoning is, how do we know that the probability of life beginning isn't astronomically small? Because if it's 1 in a trillion, and that's it. And I think Sean Carroll's often pointed this out as well. How do we have any reason to think that 10 to the power of minus 100 as the probability of life starting on a planet is any more or less likely than 10 to the minus 2, 1 in 100? I mean, how do we? It's like a probability of a probability. And so I was kind of interested in your take on this. Do you have a sense of optimism about life in the universe? Do you have reasons to favor certain choice of FL, and where is that coming from? What's your current feeling about life in the galaxy?
Yeah, so the thing is, I like to poke Sean when I talk to him about this, because when I did that New York Times op-ed based on the paper, he and somebody else, they were like, well, we don't really know what the a priori, value should be, blah, blah, blah. And I said, listen, gentlemen, before you hurt yourself, patting yourself on the back for your reasoning, you should know there's a literature on this, right? This, people have been writing papers and they've been trying to make estimates based on that. Now, all the estimates are, because this is the nature of the thing, are based on speculation, but people have tried to do work on this. And there are numbers out there that you can quote from people. And, my favorite is a paper by Carter, where he tried to use anthropic reasoning to try and generate, the probability that there's been another civilization in the known universe. And he went through this whole argument. It's a very famous paper. It's where the hard steps model, which we can talk about, comes from. But he got, 10 to the minus 20. And he was like, and there's a statement in there. I love the statement. It's like, this number is so small that there's no possibility that, there could be life anywhere else in the universe. And the number that Woody and I got by using the exoplanet data, the limit that we found was 2 orders of magnitude smaller than that, which meant that if Carter was right with his number, there were 100 other civilizations over the course of cosmic history, which may not be a lot, but it just, it shows you we're not the first, we wouldn't have been the first time. So, what the purpose of that paper to do was to put a limit, to try and use the data we had. For the first time, we had some data to at least establish the pessimism line, right? So you're absolutely right. We have no way to know what nature's actual probability, for a given planet, we don't know what nature's probability on for that planet is for generating life. But what we could say is, if it's less than 10 to the minus 22, then we are alone. If it's greater than 10 to the minus 22, we're not the first time it's happened. And so the way I like to phrase this is, so what we're talking about is 10 billion trillion experiments that have been run with planets and life and eventually civilization. If every one of those experiments failed, and it didn't fail with us, then what that means is that somehow nature is very biased. The geophysical, the biological, the sociological probabilities associated, the processes are all very biased against this ever happening again. And to me, in some sense, what that means is like, okay, since we know it happened once, then, somebody has to sort of explain to me, what are these filters, right? The great filter. What are all of these filters that after 10 to the 22 experiments, none of them other than ours made it through? So I absolutely agree that we just don't know what what Woody and I called the biotechnical probability. We don't know what it is, but the pessimism line tells you, it's like the Planck constant. It's just this number that comes out of, some basic thinking. And it tells you sort of where the dividing line is between us being the only time it's ever happened and us being truly, us being the only time it's ever happened, and a universe where and of course the interesting thing about if it happened once, if you get a technological civilization once, because technological civilizations can migrate, because they can grab hold of their own future, you could populate the whole universe from one single technological civilization, right? So
the argument about the numbers, it kind of reminds me a little bit of the fine-tuning problem with multiverses and cosmology. Mm-hmm. And so, if you change, of course, probably knows if you change any of the constants of nature by a few percent, you just essentially lose atoms and you lose the ability to have chemistry and you lose the ability to have stars. And so a lot of people would look at that and say, well, if I randomly change the parameters, it's extremely unlikely that we would get the universe we live in. And that's, right. That fine-tuning problem has been a problem. And cosmologists have often addressed it with the anthropic principle, right? They've said, well, the reason why these numbers are the way they are, it is unlikely, but it could only be this way because we live on such we could only live in a universe where it was possible to have life by definition.
Right.
And so I kind of wonder that a little bit as a counter-argument to the fact that if it happened once here, therefore it must happen elsewhere. But perhaps we're only here, it could be an incredibly small probability, but it's necessary that we live on one of the cases where it happened by virtue of being alive. So you have an anthropic principle, a cosmological anthropic principle almost being applied to astrobiology problems. So that's one of the parts I wrestle with a lot.
Yeah, and like I said, I think the actual biotechnical probability is there's right now we have no way to constrain it. I mean, hopefully with more artificial life experiments, as we come to understand more about origins of life, about the nature of life, maybe we'll be able to set other, without actually discovering other life, we'll be able to set some limits on it. But I completely agree. That paper we tried to be very clear that all we were doing was establishing that limit. But again, 10 to the 22, that's a lot of experiments to run. Doesn't mean doesn't mean it's beyond the possibility that it failed, but it just means there's a lot, because before the exoplanet revolution, we didn't know whether there were any planets at all. So there was new information in the exoplanet data, and so that allowed you to establish this pessimism line. So
and by the way, exoplanets had a giggle factor when it first started out, as you probably remember as well. The idea of looking for planets was considered almost fringe science. Yeah, and of course, once they started discovering them, everybody shuffled over. So perhaps the same thing will happen. Now we've talked about the FL term, as we would say in the Drake equation, which is the probability of a planet becoming life-bearing, spawning life. But of course, that's only part of the picture. And so the next obvious question is FI, how often do these planets go on to become intelligent? And that's really what we're interested in when we think about communication, when we think about, Of course, it'd be great to discover examples of life, but it's quite possible that we could live in a universe full of simple life, and yet what we think of as intelligence, and that's another question, is what does that word even mean about intelligent life? So I'm kind of interested in your thoughts here. How often do you think there are examples of things that we could plausibly converse with in any, maybe mathematically, maybe through not through a dialogue in terms of natural language, but perhaps there's some common basis of understanding. If we try and talk to an ant, it has some degree of intelligence, but it's not something we could really ever transfer meaningful information back and forth. And so it makes you wonder about these evolutionary processes. How diverse is that tree? And is this a fool's errand to ever expect evolution to lead to something that is humanoid or even closely conceptually similar to us, that we could have that kind of dialogue?
That's a great question. And first of all, when we think about SETI, I'd be, if it wasn't for the branding, I would be totally willing to give up the name SETI, because intelligence is what do we even mean intelligence? And I would go that's why I like Technosignatures. We're not looking for intelligence. We're looking for signatures of technology, which implies a certain kind of intelligence. But actually, this is what I love about this field. Once you start considering the, how fecund nature is and how fecund life is, that, I think you really got to broaden your views past the kind of 1950s, 1960s, white guy sort of science fiction with gleaming spaceships and, that whole view. Or something. Yeah. Yeah, right. That whole Heinlein. I mean, I love that science fiction, but it's a very limited sort of understanding of what we mean by high technology and civilizations. So just to keep on this theme a little bit. So I did this paper with David Grinspoon and Sarah Walker last year, where we talked about the idea of planetary intelligence. That the biosphere itself, it may be that we should need to kind of rethink a little bit what we mean by intelligence, and that because there's been the research, say, on the mycorrhizal, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, networks that forests have, that every tree across 500 miles is connected by these fungal networks, which move information and material around, and that the forest will, if one part of the forest is stressed, it'll send resources via these networks to that. And that, so people have talked about the idea of a green mind, that in some sense, forests have a kind of mind that we're immune to. We just haven't even begun to consider it. And I'm woogly enough to sort of think that I think there's something to that. So I just wanted to preface what we're doing with that idea that maybe that minds are, can come in all different kinds of shapes and sizes and timescales, right? Because if you imagined a forest, right, if we want to think about the Ents in Lord of the Rings, forests would think on pretty slow timescales, right? They might be thinking, and they're thinking in a way that's very different from us, but just no matter what, they're thinking on much slower timescales. So, I want to sort of put a pin in that, as Ezra Klein always likes to say.
I like that argument, and I think, by the way, I think the idea of a network fungal network, as you said, I think that was stolen by Star Trek Discovery, right? They used that with the
that's right.
the
That's
spore
right.
drive.
Yeah,
I think there's similar kind of concept there. But yeah, it's an interesting point, and it kind of makes me wonder whether I think many of us who grew up with science fiction, including myself, I'm certainly guilty of this, have this hope, this dream that one day, like in the movie Contact that Sagan wrote, of course, the original book, not the movie, but it was developed from the original book. Right. There is the idea of having that. It's almost like a fatherly conversation, right? You meet a greater intelligence and I think we have that compulsion. Maybe one of the compulsions why so many of us seek religion. And I think many of us on the other side might seek this fatherly figure in the sky that's actually some benevolent super intelligence. And I just kind of wonder if this dream that we all have in our minds is just a complete misconception, and it's not tangible, it's not possible. Yes, there might be other intelligence out there. We can certainly imagine that, but the probability of them being so aligned. I mean, Sagan used technological lockstep as the ideas of technology being in lockstep is unlikely, but evolutionary lockstep. It might be that the chance of having any kind of conscious discussion is just, it doesn't mean anything with these disparate evolutionary branches that are so different. And so that's maybe do you think we have to surrender that idea and instead just say, forget about dialogues. It's just going to be raw technosignatures. And that's really all we should focus on.
Yeah. And that's the idea of contact, when I talk with people about SETI and, technosignatures, I really try to emphasize there's multiple ways in which the emphasis on contact, which is where things got started. And what's interesting is that one of the reasons it got started is because Soviet Union and the United States were like, whoa, whoever talks to the aliens first is going to get the super weapon. But that's entirely misguided for a whole bunch of reasons. One, stars are a long way away. So, if you get a signal or you detect a technosignature from someone who's 50 light years away, it's going to be a pretty stilted conversation. Like, yo, what's up? And then 50 years later, hey, man. And 50 years later, what do you do? So it's just, so the idea that there's going to be a meaningful dialogue is just weird because of the distances. And then the other thing is, one of my favorite movies is Arrival, the science fiction movie. And I love that because, they meet this, obviously, advanced civilization, and they send in a Carl Sagan scientist who's going to talk to them with math, and a linguist who understands, that language is not just, information theory. There's more, there's more going on. And of course, the Carl Sagan figure fails miserably. It's like holding up, 1 and 1 = 2 Pythagorean theorem. And they're, what are you talking about? And the linguist who understands that, languages are living expressions of ecologies of sentient beings is the one who's able to make contact. So, and the thing is also about communications. Like you rightly point out, like everybody wants, the cure for cancer from the aliens. But to me, even if we found microbes, it would be revolutionary because life, like we know of lots of things that the universe does, right? Stars, comets, black holes, they're all really interesting, but nothing compares to life. Life is nothing compares to the creativity, nothing else has agency or autonomy, right? So if even microbes we find one example of microbes somewhere else, it just shows that, we're not a fluke, and that life and its incredible creative capacity, if we find one example, to me, then there's lots. Like, all we need is one other example. And then for me, the inference is that there's lots of examples. And then who knows where it goes? Yeah. Who knows what it can do?
Yeah. And you said something that just piqued my interest. I just want to follow up. And you said that, the messaging is like 50-year time delay for a conversation, and to us that feels like almost a waste of time because we were selfish beings. We're like, well, I'm not going to be around, so what do I care? We are selfish. And as someone pointed out to me about climate change, they said, how different would our view of climate change be if our lifespans were thousands of years? Right. If there is an effort to some degree to extend human lifetimes, of course, at the moment, treating aging as a disease, and in the same way that we might completely transform, it's not a long-term problem anymore. It's a short-term problem in our lifetimes. Right. I wonder how thinking about astrobiology and the search for life in the universe would also transform if it were that our lifespans could be greatly extended. And that's, I guess, kind of relevant to our later conversation as well that we're leading into. But I just wanted to pick up on that thought. I wonder if you had any follow-up on that.
Yeah, no, that's a very, important idea. And this is true actually even for the development of interstellar civilizations, right? One of the, let's assume that the speed of light really is, a limit. Then unless you're very long lived, it's hard to imagine having the individual lifespan of the organism is, hundreds or thousands of years. It's hard to imagine interstellar civilization, because if it takes 50 years to cross the distance, then, a planetary civilization will drift relative to its neighbors. And so it's hard to imagine having a galactic empire, unless you have beings that are very long lived. So, but yeah, I mean, if for the communication, it's not like I'm against communication. I just think until the human lifespans are extended or something, it's not going to be that relevant for us, because, or what we're, especially right now, like what's happening right now, this enormous progress we're making in astrobiology and potentially with technosignatures, that contact is just not, communication is just, for right now, not going to be the centerpiece.
Yeah, I like that. We're kind of sectioning off intelligent or technosignatures and dialogues, whereas they have traditionally sort of been seen as a unilayer, but right. It's probably another step. Now, one question I want to ask you, I mean, this is obviously
can I just build on that? There you see that traditional SETI was about beacons. It assumed someone was the whole idea was that someone was trying to communicate with you. Now, later on, and Woody Sullivan was one of the first to start thinking about leakage, that you could see, you could might be able to see some radio signals just from, their normal day-to-day activity. But once we discovered exoplanets, what I call metabolic technosignatures, like they're just going around about their business. They don't care whether or not they're communicating with anybody. They're just doing the things that a civilization does to maintain itself. That's probably what we're going to see. I think the most potent technosignatures may be exactly those things that are just, inadvertent signals from activity. Yeah.
Now, one of the pieces of work I know that you've touched on as well, and you kind of alluded to a little bit, is expansion. And if we do get planets that go on to form intelligence, they have the capability potentially, there's no real physical obstacle as far as we can tell, right, why they couldn't spread across the galaxy on shockingly short timescales compared to the age of the galaxy.
Right.
And so in the optimistic view, which we might want to have, and I think we kind of have to have some sense of optimism when we search for technosignatures.
Yeah.
How do we reconcile this is really alluding to Fermi's paradox, which is somewhat of a misnomer, of course. It's not truly a paradox, I think, in the traditional sense of the word. But nevertheless, how do we reconcile the observational, apparent observational evidence that the universe doesn't appear engineered? We don't see any stellar engineering or galactic spanning empires. How do we reconcile that with the search for technosignatures and holding out some optimism that we will succeed at some point?
Yeah, well, okay. So like I always like to point out, there's two kinds of the Fermi Paradox gets used two ways, one of which is totally incorrect. So the incorrect way is to say like, we've looked for intelligent life indirectly via searches, for SETI searches of the stars, and we haven't found any, therefore it doesn't exist, right? And that, as Jason Wright showed, because of the giggle factor, there's never really been any money for SETI or for these searches. So if the parameter space we have to search is the ocean, what we have searched so far is a hot tub, right? And you can't search for a hot tub. You can't search for fish, a hot tub's worth of fish, not find it and say, well, the ocean has no fish in it, right? So that part we can put aside because that just really hasn't been done. The true Fermi paradox, the one that Fermi was talking about that day in 1950, was why aren't they here now, right? Like literally, why aren't they here? Because that's what he was talking about, that as you pointed out, the timescales, even sub-light speed travel, you can cross the galaxy in about 600,000 years. And so then every place, a civilization, a long-lived civilization, should be able to sort of touch every part of, and that one, I think that's still really interesting questions about that. Now, one of the things that, that paper that I did with Gavin Schmidt is we recognize, because the question is, well, maybe they haven't visited Earth recently. Maybe they were here 30 million years ago, right? And they set up shop for 10,000 years and then left.
So Fermi's premise is wrong in that case then.
Right. That there's because you have to view the idea of Fermi's paradox is that, it's easy for them to hop from one place to another. And then the question is just, when was the last time they were here? They may not set up shop everywhere or stay for a long time. And we know civilizations have finite time. So maybe they start a civilization on Earth in the Precambrian, and it lasts 200,000 years, which by our start would be a huge amount of time, but it would leave no record. So we wouldn't know, that was the point of that paper. So, I would say is that the Fermi's paradox, the part that people usually claim for Fermi's paradox is not true. We just haven't looked. And the other part, is a really interesting question, but I think there's lots of ways in which one can say why they're not here now. Unless, of course, you're a UFO enthusiast, and then you're like, they are here now. But that's another story. Okay,
yeah. So I guess you just would say there's lots of ways out at this point. There's many solutions that we haven't capped off yet, and that's kind of what we're trying to do ultimately.
Yeah, because when you say that we haven't seen galactic engineering, have we looked for galactic engineering? How do we know that we've seen? And this is the problem also, as we're going to talk about, for truly long-lived civilizations. What exactly do they? What are the technosignatures for the million-year-old civilization? And that's a very big question. It could be like galactic scale engineering. It could be disappearing into the laws of physics themselves in some sense, becoming, the Star Trek energy beings or something. So it's, a really long.
Well, let's talk about that now, because we've been teasing it. We've been teasing it on this conversation that we're going towards long-lived civilizations, and it's really what I wanted to hear your views about. I mean, it's longevity is such an important component of how we think about the search for alien life, not only in terms of their abilities, but just in terms of the Drake equation. Of course, there's the L term at the end, right? And the bigger you make L, the longer they hang around, the easier it is to detect. So it's clearly central to this story we're on, and yet it's something that doesn't have as much attention, I think, in the literature. And I think, we've pointed out there's been a lot of focus on radio searches, but this discussion of longevity is maybe less well explored. Now, I know you're thinking about this a lot, and especially you're thinking about very long-lived civilizations. So why don't you tell us about what sparked that line of thought, why you think it's important, and what kind of things you're chewing on right now in this dialogue?
Yeah, well, I mean, so there's been this, in the literature, people have often, hypothesized that the civilization that you're going to find is going to be much longer than yours, or older than yours. But then you did that great work, which you invited Caleb and I on, which you proved that, with a really nice Bayesian analysis, that, if you find a civilization, odds are it's going to be older than yours, right? So this was kind of floating around in people's minds that just, we're very short-lived. If you go out and you look for something, your odds are you're going to find the thing that's been around for a long time, right? Rather than the thing that only exists for, a moment. So, based on your work, we can say conclusively that yes, the civilizations you find should on average be older than yours, right? And we have been around, when you look at like planetary timescales, right? The technosphere, the human technosphere has been around like, it's been a blink of an eye, right? And it's not even clear if we're going to last for, another few hundred years. I can definitely, with all the shenanigans going on right now, I can imagine that it's highly complex, highly networked civilization that we've built. It's just not going to be able to hold together. It's just, we don't have the cognitive capacities to deal with something societally this complicated. So we've been around for just a blip. But the question is, if we make it, right? If we make it become a spacefaring species, if we, really can begin to have other, have settlements on Mars, have settlements in space, what do we become? So, one hand, we're thinking about technosignatures, we're also thinking about our own future. That's what makes this really interesting. But the problem is, as you run for, thinking about 5,000 years. Okay, well, I have examples of, civilizations that are 5,000 years old. 10,000 years, well, we were hunter-gatherers mostly 10,000 years ago. 100,000 years, we were around, Homo sapiens were around, but it's really hard to say what we were. Now, a million years, right? We weren't human. There were no Homo sapiens a million years ago. So these spans of time are so vast. And what we see from our own recent evolution of the technosphere is that the technological evolution is so fast that how? Before I can even say what's going to happen, I need to know, how do I even think about this in some systematic way, in some way that I'm not just writing science fiction stories. And in fact, actually, writing science fiction stories may be one of the best ways of doing it. I've always wanted to gather, because the problem is astronomers, we're not necessarily the people to do this, right? You need a kind of imagination that will rope in anthropological understandings, historical understandings, evolutionary understandings. And so, novelists sometimes are better at this, and they may be better at this than we are. But right, the first thing we have to do is figure out how to think along these lines, and then we can think about what might happen. And the how to think, we're doing a project now with the grant led by Jacob Hock-Misra, where we're looking at future studies. So, for climate change, people are trying to identify ways of systematically mapping out futures for the next 50, 100 years, right? Where you're way beyond prediction. It's just too many variables to predict what the world's going to be like in 100 years. But still, you want to kind of understand the fan of scenarios. People call it scenario analysis. So we're trying to adapt that to this problem, to use some of that systematic thinking to understand. So what you're going to get is not a prediction, but you're going to say, look, given these set of assumptions, these are the fan of possibilities. These other assumptions, these are the fan of possibilities.
Now one thing I want to ask you about here with longevity, we've sort of, the way we've been discussing it so far, it's quite linear. It's the story of us. And when we think of longevity in the anthropogenic case, we really think about how long will we persist? And you rightly point out that many of us might have a sense of pessimism about how complex and networked our planet is. It doesn't take much, or it just takes a spark almost to pull that down. But one thing I wonder what your thoughts on this are about intelligence as a persistent phenomena, and not so much that it's us. I mean, there are so many evolutionary traits, such as the eukaryote cell or combigenesis, sex, that persisted. I mean, once evolution finds something which gives a significant evolutionary advantage, life has a tendency to diversify it and spawn it in all different directions and forms. And life is quite difficult to completely exterminate off a planet.
Yeah.
To what degree is human civilization difficult to exterminate? And taking that a step further, intelligence a difficult thing to exterminate? Could we have recurrences, again, kind of reversing your Cyrillian hypothesis, either forward in time? If you were to project out the next remaining billion years of habitability of the Earth, can you see a scenario where this was it? This was the only time that we had intelligence? Or do you think intelligence is going to be here for the end now?
God, it's hard for me to judge that, right? I mean, because like you said, with the eukaryotes, once you had eukaryotes, it was like, this is a great idea, and it incurred such evolutionary advantage that suddenly, boom, 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 you get everybody, all these different forms of life that are using that floor plan. So, so for example, if humanity went extinct tomorrow, let's say, nuclear war or something, because, nuclear war is not going to wipe out the biosphere. Would the biosphere be like, well, this was a pretty good idea, in some sense, and somebody else picks it up, some other, social, there's lots of different, we think we need sociability, so it'd have to probably be a social creature. So, whether the naked mole rat, in 30 million years, there's a naked mole rat civilization. That's hard. I have to really think about that. I mean, I'm not sure, and whether it would be technological, whether it would develop technological intelligence or not. I mean, again, I do sort of think, going back to this idea of planetary intelligence, that in some sense, the whole planet the biosphere is already intelligent, right? And so in that sense, the spark is always waiting to be relit on some level. Okay,
so maybe if you're not comfortable with the evolutionary aspect, let's just step back to the human aspect. So let's say, climate change goes horribly wrong. We don't reverse this, and agriculture goes to crap, and, a huge fraction, God forbid, of civilization collapses. And, I'm kind of thinking of, like Jared Diamond's book, Collapse, where he describes these pockets of civilization that collapse. But it's difficult to imagine how every single human being could be exterminated or even enough to completely kill the species as a whole, to lead to extermination. So if humans persist, and given our abilities and our traits, it seems there is an inherent advantage that we have by our smarts that would lead to some kind of recurrence. But maybe I'm being optimistic by thinking that.
I agree. And this is one of the things when we think about the million-year civilization, of course there may be dips, right? It's hard, when we think about the million-year civilization, should we be thinking as one continuous, line of, Rome for a million years? It's hard to, probably, I would guess not, based on our own history. That
it's more like the stock market. There's crashes, there's bear markets,
there's crashes, and bull markets, and there's and there's moments. But you don't once it's just like if the dinosaurs had we just had the DART mission, right, where we moved an asteroid. If the dinosaurs had that, they'd still be around, right? So, and this is David Grinspoon's point that with intelligence you may be able to enter, if you're wise enough, to enter the Sapiezoic eon. Right. So eons on the earth are measured in billions of years, or, that's the time scale. And so if you develop intelligence and you develop some wisdom about your own management of that, perhaps you become immortal in a certain sense. And maybe there's dips, like you go through perturbations, but you've already gotten to the point where you're not going to end. There's nothing that's going to be, especially if you spread out that, through space. That you're going to persist in some form or another, as long as the universe has free energy to be drawn. Yeah,
I'm thinking, of course, of Isaac Asimov's Foundation a little bit as well, and how that's obviously a galactic spanning version of this, but we could imagine a planet spanning version of Foundation as well, where if there's enough information that persists in vaults somewhere, our books and our knowledge can be stored, then you might expect the spark to reignite even faster each time.
Right. Yeah, no, because I don't think whatever disaster we may be headed for, climate change, whatever, I could imagine the current version of civilization falls apart. But in another few hundred years, we'd rebuild it. Maybe we rebuild it differently. Maybe we wouldn't have this global spanning kind of thing, but we'd still have, there'd be pockets, or there'd be forms of, I don't think I think we're going to go on. And then, and the question is, can you get to a certain point where really, and again, this is part of the idea that you have to maybe have settlements and self-propagating or maintaining settlements in space. Once you get off your home planet, once you get a number of different planets, then now the game's completely changed. And now, you can start spreading through the universe. And even if you're not a single coherent civilization, this kind of intelligence has spread. And that's why I think even one example of microbial intelligence could point to the fact that, the universe is full of life. And if any of it got intelligent or, gained these kinds of capacities, then it could change the whole nature of the universe. It's interesting. Alan Lightman had a recent, and I love Alan, but he was sort of saying no matter what, life can't possibly matter because it still weighs nothing compared to all the planets and stars. But I don't really think that's true, because I just don't know what the limits of life are. Once life gets started, it's proven itself to be so creative that, like we said, it could start engineering stars. It could, I love Caleb Sharf's thing about the idea that you actually become the laws of physics, right? Which is in Interstellar, right? In that movie Interstellar, it's our future selves who manipulate the structure of space and time to come back and allow us to save ourselves, so we can become our future selves who are literally kind of in the fabric of space and time.
I wanted to ask you about the sustainability paradox when it comes to longevity. Now, this basically is an argument that, what we're doing right now, we talk about climate change as a technosignature. It's not sustainable, right? We can't just, yes, we shine very bright in a way, because the more we screw up our planet, the easier we are to detect. The greater our disequilibrium with nature, the more obvious we are to another civilization to see. And yet we know that that's not a sustainable path forward. And we are already ourselves trying to find more sustainable ways of living. And so perhaps the search for kind of interested in this balance. We might think there are lots of long-lived civilizations out there, but perhaps they're invisible to us because they become so sustainable that there's no chance of seeing any disequilibria within their biospheres. And vice versa, does that imply that the most likely folks we're ever going to make contact with or detect would be essentially, the most unsustainable civilizations, those who are ethically corrupt, who are just happy to just, ruin their planet as fast as possible, because that would be the easiest thing for us to see if that happened.
Slobs.
So tell us a little about your thoughts on this.
I used to think that was true, that the more, the more you are on a path to sustainable, the more you disappear. But now I don't really think that's true anymore, because, just because you're sustainable doesn't mean you're invisible, or doesn't mean that you don't have an effect on the planet. Because really what I think when we imagine a truly high tech, if you're still high tech, you're still drawing a huge amount of energy, but the thing is you've managed to bring the biosphere with you. All boats rise, right? So like, for example, one way of thinking about technosignatures is disequilibrium. That, the energy flowing through, there's energy that's being harvested, that's flowing through the system, and it keeps the system, the planetary system, from sort of settling down into a dead equilibrium. And we know this is true for biospheres, because that's why, we think of oxygen and methane as being such great biosignatures, because it's life which is keeping the chemistry of the planet out of equilibrium. So if you have a technosphere now, which is thriving and which is sustainable, it still is going to be drawing a huge amount of energy to power the technosphere. And it will, I think there will still be, like, for example, I still think there will be traces of disequilibrium that can be seen, even more disequilibrium in some sense, that will be seen. The biosphere will be thriving, but the whole system will be harvesting more free energy for various purposes. And it's not like, a sustainable planet can still have city lights. A sustainable civilization can, and if anything, so one of the ideas we're playing with now a lot, that we're working on a paper on with the group, is the idea of service worlds, right? So you can imagine, like, okay, I've got all this industry, I've got all this energy harvesting I need to do. Well, put it on the moon, or you probably have a few planets, that really are uninhabitable, have no biospheres. Well, put it there. Put it, collect all of your nastiness and put it on the service world. And the cool thing about service worlds is they would shine. They would be there. There's no biosphere, so you don't have to worry about any kind of false positive. And they'd be covered in solar collectors, which would reflect a huge amount of ultraviolet light, or they would be glowing, in mining tailings or something.
Radioactivity or something.
Yeah. So I think a civilization that becomes sustainable will still be visible.
I was just thinking about Carl Schroeder's statement that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from nature, whereas the original version from Arthur C. Clarke was indistinguishable from magic.
Right.
And so what kinds of things could a super advanced civilization be doing that we would perhaps think was just natural processes? Could we not even distinguish from nature?
Yeah, no, that's possible, especially for a million-year civilization. Again, this idea that, like, at some point you become so potent at manipulating the laws of physics that you kind of actually become the laws of physics. You add to the laws of physics, so that, you imagine if you had the capacity to really work with gravitons, right? And, you figured out quantum gravity, and you could, manipulate the world at the level of the graviton. That, would the things you're doing look any different from what we see on a supermassive black hole or such? So I think it's a really interesting problem. I don't know what we can do with it right now. But again, one of the interesting things about technosignatures is it's never been systematic, right? I mean, that's the problem, is that there's people would write a paper, they put it somewhere, usually in a journal that, nobody has access to, or often it's what they call the gray literature. It was in a conference proceeding, or it was even just in an essay they wrote. And the job now is to start to collect and systematize these ideas so that we can at least begin to evaluate, which ones are worth pursuing. Because there are some, like you said, if every million-year civilization becomes indistinguishable from nature, truly, then what are you going to do? okay, there's just nothing you can say about that. So if that's the way it is, then the search won't go anywhere. But of course, there's no reason to assume that's true. It's one argument. So, but that's why we have to kind of begin to evaluate systematically what the possibilities are, so that then we can then pursue the ones that we can pursue.
And then maybe to close out, I mean, since this is the Golden Record project that really inspires this podcast and this conversation, there is a I mean, we talked about dialogue perhaps being the third step. It might be a long way off, but a time capsule, to some degree, is both a technosignature and an attempt at a dialogue, both together. Yeah. It is a beacon doing both of those things. It's a physical beacon rather than a radio wave that's traveling out at the speed of light. But I kind of wonder, two parts to this question. What would you want to discover in a time capsule of another civilization? Ooh. What would you hope to obtain from that? And what do you think does that mean that that's what we should be sending out? Or do you think we should filter to some degree what we send out to these other civilizations?
Wow, that's worth a paper in and of itself to think about this. I would certainly, the first thing I would want to know is body plan and biology. I would just, tell me about how your biology works. Are you carbon based? What is how do you handle information transfer? And what do you look like? Just what do you look like? I just want to know what you look like, and then, if there's any way that they could tell us about their cognitive systems, right? If there's any way they could describe what the word, there's that famous philosophical paper by Nagels, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? If there was any way they could tell me what it was like to be them, perceptual systems, and then be above that, so once I knew about I wanted to know about how they experience the world. Then I would like to know how they think about the world. What do they think about themselves? And, the weird thing about life is that, as Francisco Varela says, it's life is always persistence in, under duration, right? The whole thing, every creature on Earth has to maintain itself, be self-maintaining and self-creating in difficult circumstances. And eventually you lose. Eventually it's over, right? So life is always just like this very hard. It's hard to be alive. And so, I would love to know, what's their perspective on that? Everybody dies and it's so weird. What are we doing here? So ultimately, I'd like to know about whatever their philosophies and their religions. So, I'd make that, from are you carbon based to, are you religious? Those are the things.
That's fascinating. Yeah, because I think a lot of folks might get hung up on what's their technology, what's their, how sophisticated is their fusion reactors or whatever it is. But you're right that it is perhaps more interesting because we know physics, but what we don't know is the psychology of an alien being, what it means to be alive for them. Yeah. Like I said, that idea of what is it like? What is it like?
Because what was great about Nagels with that expression was he recognized this quality of the interior experience, right? What is it like to be you? I cannot know what it's like to be you. I can only know what it's like to be me. And then you turn that into a species wide. I know what it's like to be a human. I don't know what it's like to be a bat. And so now this entirely different lineage, these creatures that came from an entirely different evolutionary lineage, what is it like to be that? Is it completely different that we can't even talk to each other? Or are there points of communion, or communication?
Yeah. Adam, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you for your time. And, I think this is always one of my favorite opportunities to get to just talk about the prospects of life in the universe. And you, as I said, you're one of the funnest people to explore this with very openly. And this has been a lot of fun for me intellectually. It's given me lots of ideas actually after this.
I was going to say, I think we have 3 or 4 ideas for a paper here. So we should talk offline and be all right, first we'll write this one, then we'll write that one. Yeah.
Let's get busy. So thank you again for your time. Thank you again for listening, everybody. This is the Interstellar podcast. Be sure to check out the other episodes. Thank you for your time, and we will see you in the next one.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.